Now that I've taken the red pill on the Dune franchise, that it was always like slop propped up by propagandists, I find it very interesting how so many other people kind of agree with me on this take. I've always been aware that like the opinions on like the Dune sequels have been divided. Like everybody hates everything that happened after Frank Hubert died, and like I've come to learn that like plenty of people don't even like the immediate sequel to Dune, Dune Messiah, because of the themes and the ideas and stuff like that. Like I find that very, very, very interesting to me, especially hearing how, J.R.R. Tolkien himself like spoke out about how much he detested Dune. Even though he didn't emphasize why, I find it very interesting that the premier fantasy author in the English language, spoke out about Dune's lack of quality, even if it was privately, you know. And he didn't express exactly why that was, why he felt that way, but I do think it's very clear to see why. Is that Dune is very similar to like Game of Thrones in this sense, where like it's a story, a fantasy story concocted by someone with a very warped, twisted worldview. So someone like George R. R. Martin is a boomer who like grew up, having everything handed to him and having all these opportunities and like being a hedonistic, materialistic fuck. And so in his version of reality, everyone's like that. So that's why everyone in Game of Thrones is malicious. Why they don't have any redeeming qualities at all. If like you're a good person, you get like smacked down by the realities of the world. Like it's pretty obvious, like reading Game of Thrones enough that like this isn't something that actually happens. Okay. Like eventually things would settle down and like it's an interesting, like Game of Thrones really tries to present itself as if it's like subversive to the typical like fantasy story, but like, oh, the protagonist can be killed, but like all it really does is mislead you on who the protagonists actually are. The protagonists are not the Starks. They are the Targaryens. When you take that into consideration, like the entire premise of Game of Thrones falls apart. This idea that like nobody is safe and that people can die randomly and that like there's all this conspiracy and machinations. Like no, like the reality of the situation is like the Targaryens are the protagonists. They're immune to everything that happens. Jon Snow literally comes back to life. It's like, okay, bro. Like, it's just, again, this is why Game of Thrones was such a failure. This is why like anybody with any actual experience in the fantasy genre like kind of turns their nose up at Game of Thrones, because A Song of Ice and Fire, excuse me, like at this series, because like yes, not only has it not been finished, it wasn't really building up to anything to begin with. I personally, I've always expressed this opinion. I was not surprised at all when I read that like George R. R. Martin primarily has a history in TV writing, because it's what he does is very similar to like the typical TV show structure, in which they try setting up all these like engaging setups from episode one to get people watching as much as possible, with no real like structure on or plan on like how things are going to end. Like the idea is to keep people engaged with everything that's happening in the moment, so that they keep tuning in week after week to see more and more stuff, like more and more plot lines developed, and not it becomes such a snarl that it just ends up ending in the most underwhelming way possible. Which is what happened when when the TV show ended with season 8. Like they simply didn't resolve any of the plots that they had established, because all they had been doing for the entire run of the show, this wasn't like a later season thing, this was like from the very beginning, was just establish a bunch of plot lines that had no resolution. They were just meant to be hooks to get you engaged in the story. So that's very important when talking about like A Song of Ice and Fire, and why it's such an underwhelming disappointment. But for me, like I feel like Dune, it shows a lot of the same trademarks as as the Martin. You know, like the generations are different, the mindset are different, but like the behavior is very similar. You know, like you see people do this thing where like, oh, like Dune started off great, and then somewhere along the line it's lost its way. Like Hubert was a genius and he had all these great ideas that were explored throughout the first two books, the first one specifically, and like as the series developed, he lost the plot. You know, that's always been the mindset. That's always been the narrative. But like if you really like analyze like Hubert's like opinions and his takes and like the themes of what Dune was supposed to be about, you know, a deconstruction of like the Messiah archetype and stuff like that. Like you really do realize that like Dune just kind of failed at everything it set out to do. You know, this idea that it's some like statement against like the idea of like the savior archetype or like the subversion of this kind of like fantasy thing. You know, it just doesn't work at all. Like it doesn't have any real weight to it, and that's why people feel that the sequels are so underwhelming. Is that like the things that happen after in the context of like the original Dune novel, like everything that the characters do make perfect sense. Everything that Paul does makes perfect sense. And this idea that like, well, things get bad in Dune Messiah, like, yeah, but like the decisions were made considering the circumstances at the time. So like so this idea that like you know someone being you know taking on a leadership position and then like making bad changes bad choices eventually or whatever like that doesn't really matter, that doesn't ruin like their actual accomplishments or what they did in the past. Like it just doesn't mean inherently that like this idea is like fundamentally flawed. This idea that someone can come and like you know make things better because you know people make things better all the time. You know it happens every day in all kinds of circumstances in all kinds of situations. You know this idea that like people are like fundamentally evil is just like it's just completely misplaced and doesn't really fit in very well uh, with reality. Like it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Like again, I really do need to like learn more about Dune to like give my take on it. You know, like you've probably noticed that I focus more on like the Song of Ice and Fire thing, but like that's because I've spent a lot more time like understanding like why I don't really like a Song of Ice and Fire. I'm only just like scratching the surface on like why Dune really fundamentally at its core does not work. So this is definitely something I'm becoming increasingly passionate about. Um, but yeah, I this is something I do think you know we as YouTubers, we as conservatives, we as like human beings, we do need to acknowledge this. Like classic novels aren't necessarily good. You know, this is like the reality that I've been faced. You know, reading so many like Pulitzer Prize winners and so many like iconic classic novels. Like a lot of these people, a lot of them were socialists. They were out of touch with reality. They never worked real jobs. They don't actually know what normal people are like. You know, that's kind of like my reoccurring experience like dealing with people in my sphere is that like they read so many books and like have so many warped perspectives on life and on human beings and on society and like culture and stuff like that that they don't realize that the reality is quite a bit different than what they've built it up in their minds, right? They have this very narrow perspective on very hyper fix on this very like on very strange kind of things that they've observed in society and just kind of like revolve their entire identity around it. You know, Hubert, I think, like really detested the idea that like um, JFK was going to fix all the problems and like, you know, the worship of the president and stuff like that, which is like a reasonable take to have, I think. But at the same time, um, like other people can step up, you know, other people can do things, you know, like other people are like if the savior fails, if the savior doesn't really accomplish what he set out to do, like another person would just like take his place essentially. That's basically kind of how I see Dune in the sense is that like if Paul didn't do anything, like someone else would have eventually. It's kind of like in an inevitability in that sense. Obviously, yeah. But anyway, yeah. Thank you for watching this video, and I will see you all next time. Thank you.